Shen sent to left reminder Du Fu. As one, we climb the cinnabar steps. Then each goes off to his office cubicle. At dawn, we all file in behind the imperial regalia. At dusk, we carry home the odor of the palace. White-haired, we grieve for fallen blossoms. From these dark clouds, we envy soaring birds. Since imperial decisions are without fault, our critical petitions will be rather few. So here we have yet another of Shen's poems. Shen has already been encountered. I think we've read at least 4 poems by him already. He has a total of 7 in this anthology, which is not a negligible number. I mean, he's not in number of poems in the same league as Du Fu or Li Bai, or even Wang Wei, but he's at least in the bronze medal category of poets, with which around 10 poems published in this anthology. So Shen, if you remember, is a Hai Tang poet. He was a friend of Du Fu. In fact, he is dedicating this poem to his friend Du Fu, while they're both serving at the imperial court. And you will also remember that even though he passed the official examinations, he spent most of his time of service in the company of military men and generals in the northwestern frontier. In fact, he has become typeset with that sort of poetry, with the military frontier type of poetry. But of course, that's always a simplification, and this poem is a physical embodiment of the fact that Shen was able to write poems on completely different subject matter from war and the frontiers. So what is this poem of Shen's about? Well, first some background. If you will remember, Du Fu and Shen were serving both at the time of the An Lushan rebellion. Now, in 755, the capital falls. Du Fu is a prisoner in the capital. He manages to get away. I think in some previous video I mentioned that he was taken to Luoyang and forced to serve the rebels there, but I think that was a mistake of mine. I probably mistook that biographical information with information about Wang Wei, who was taken east. So Du Fu manages to escape from the capital, and he goes to the new emperor Suzong's camp in Fengxiang. At about the same time, or a little after that, Shen returns with the troops of the northwest, and he also joins the emperor at Fengxian, and on the recommendation of Du Fu, he is given a post in the government. Now, this poem was composed probably about 757, when the government and the emperor are back in the capital in Chang'an, and both Shen and Du Fu are serving together in the imperial administration, and it's probably an expression of thanks from Shen to Du Fu. So what's the topic of this poem? Well, I would say there are 2 main topics in this poem. One more implicit and the other more explicit. So the explicit topic seems to be, the typical example of political flattery of the court and the situation at the time being. So Shen is writing a poem in which he comments, in which he describes the way in which he and his friend Du Fu serve in the administration, and at the same time he praises this administration as being quite good, worthy of serving. As important, or more important than this, but more subtle, is probably the fact that this is a poem of friendship. So it's emphasizing how both Du Fu and Shen share one mind and partially one space, the space of the court, even while they are separate because they serve in different government bodies, and while at the court they have to be in different places at the same time. But they share the same passion, serving the state, serving the emperor, Confucian values, even if they might feel some nostalgia and the typical scholarly official sadness at the passage of time, or the lures and the pleasures of the retired life. So, as I said, very different from the typical poetry related to war. So this is more of a courtly and friendship poem by Shen. So in the title, Du Fu is styled left reminder because that was his position at the time. Now, I've already encountered a translation of this poem in another collection, the Poems from the Masters anthology, which includes Tang and Sung poems. And this is a poem I like a lot, and not because particularly it's a particular well-crafted work of art, but because of its subject matter, because, you know, knowing the disposition of the imperial palace is something that helps you to better perceive, better understand this poem. Now, this is a hobby horse of mine, the imperial capital, its buildings, its neighborhoods, its palaces. So before we go into this detail, so the imperial palace, there were different imperial palaces in Chang'an. The emperors had different ones. But the main one during most of the Tang dynasty was the so-called Daming Palace, which was in the northeast of the capital. Now, like most Chinese palaces, imperial Tang palaces were really a compound, a walled compound, which included a series of different pavilions and gateways in a sort of processional order, if you wish. So the imperial palace first had a double function. On the one hand, it was the residence of the emperor, but on the other hand, it was the place where the bureaucrats, where the imperial administration worked. And people like Du Fu and Shen entered the imperial palace to go to their offices in the imperial administration. But again, the imperial palace had a lot of pavilions, and some of them were only for the emperor or for the emperor and his intimates. Generally, the structure of imperial palaces is at the bottom in the south. There is a magnificent gate from which the emperor might make some public speeches or events, especially the New Year reception is done at this major gate at the south. Then we have a courtyard and other buildings perhaps, and then we have the first of the important pavilions, which was the pavilion for the great state acts, and this would be the outer court. So in the case of the Daming Palace, you first had the Dafeng Gate, which is a massive, gigantic wooden gate for entering the palace. Then you had the first courtyard, and then you would find the first of the halls, the outer hall, the Han Yuan Hall, which was, you know, the place for receiving foreign ambassadors, for diplomatic exchanges, and for some of the state ceremonies. Behind this, you would have yet another very big courtyard with another main pavilion and many other small pavilions. So this is the inner or the middle court, and here's where the offices of the administration would have been. So here we would have the Xuanzhen Hall, which was the main hall where the emperor talked with his ministers and where state affairs were conducted. And also here we would have the main buildings of the administration, which is where Du Fu and Shen worked. The three main departments of the empire at this time were the Secretariat, the Chongshusheng, the Department of State Affairs, the Shangshusheng, and the Chancellery, the Mengxiasheng. And the main functions basically was the Secretariat proposed policies, the Chancellery revised those policies, and the Department of State Affairs implemented them. So why am I mentioning all this? Well, to conclude with the part of the imperial palace, there would still be an inner court beyond the middle court with a big hall, the Sichen Hall, where the emperor would summon only the officials he wanted to honor, and it would have a lot of pavilions with gardens for the pleasure and the private recreation of the emperor, and some religious buildings, and a hall for the literati that were immediately on the service of the emperor, the Linde Hall, and a few other buildings. So, okay, as I said, why am I mentioning all this? Well, in this poem, as we will see when we comment couplet by couplet, Shen and Du Fu are entering the imperial palace. This happened in the morning. Civil servants even before dawn had to line up before the Danfeng gate that we mentioned before. They were led into the palace in big long processions. And there they were, recognized, searched by the bodyguards, and then they were sent to their respective offices. So what this poem is describing is how Shen and Du Fu enter the palace. They enter the middle court, and there they separate. So on the left of the middle court, I believe, was the secretariat, and on the right was the chancellery. Du Fu worked at the chancellery, Shen worked at the secretariat. Okay, then, so having given all this background information, let's go couplet by couplet with the interpretation of this poem. As one we climb the cinnabar steps, then each goes off to his office cubicle. So the poem starts with an image of unity and separation, which underlies the message of the poem, that Du Fu and Shen are like one in their values, in their desire to serve the empire, in their position as scholar officials serving the imperial court, but each to his own. Each has to go to his own duties and responsibilities. So as one they climb the cinnabar steps. The cinnabar steps are the steps of the palace, the steps of the imperial palace. So the borders of these stairways that led to the inner halls were included cinnabar painted balustrades. That was the imperial color. And then each goes off to his office cubicle. Yeah? So each goes, basically, one goes to the left, the other goes to the right. One goes to the secretariat, and the other has to go to the chancellery. Okay, next couplet. At dawn, we all file in behind the imperial regalia. At dusk, we carry home the odor of the palace. So work takes place in the palace from dawn till dusk. Civil servants are expected to be at the service of the empire and the emperor all day long. So in the morning they get there, they file in behind the imperial regalia. That is, they make lines and present themselves to the emperor, probably in the hall that we mentioned previously, in the Xuanzhang Hall. There would be a morning reception of all the civil servants who would bow in front of the emperor. And after this, each went their own ways. Each went to their own offices in the palace. And they would carry home the odor of the palace. I imagine there was incense. I mean, I imagine this is used metaphorically, like the scent of being in the imperial presence and on serving the empire. I don't think this refers to a real scent, although it could, perhaps the offices of the chancellery or the secretariat were included incense burners and things like that. But I think it's used metaphorically, after having imbued ourselves of the imperial presence and having done our duty to the emperor, we go back home. Third couplet. White-haired, we grieve for fallen blossoms. From these dark clouds, we envy soaring birds. Now, up to now, the poem has been very Confucian, like we too serve the emperor, we serve the country. The last couplet is going to go back to that idea, but this couplet, interjects a slightly discordant element, which is, we're serving, but we might prefer to do other things. So, white-haired, we grieve for fallen blossoms. So, Shen and Du Fu are no longer young. And like all poets, almost all poets that appear in this anthology, they are keenly aware of the passage of time. So their hairs are white. They might be sad at the passage of time and feel that life is passing and that they probably should be enjoying themselves and not just toiling in the service of the country as good Confucians. And from these dark clouds we envy soaring birds. It points in the same direction. This is Taoist imagery, the floating cloud, the soaring bird, images of freedom, of not being subjugated to the toils and works of the administration, which must have been pretty boring and bureaucratic work anyway. Composing poems was only a requisite for entering the job, but then the job was clerical and boring for most of the civil servants. Those dark clouds could also be a metaphor at the warlike and chaotic times in which both Du Fu and Shen have to serve. This was a time of war. Remember, this same year the capital was recovered from the rebels, and the country would still be at war with those rebels for some decades, and chaos would continue for a long, long time. The conclusion. Since imperial decisions are without fault, our critical petitions will be rather few. So the poem ends on a note of outright flattery to the contemporary times into service. I imagine it's more an expression of wishful thinking than probably a realistic depiction of reality. But it says, the emperor is so wise. We live in such a nice time in which the ruler matches himself with heaven and follows heaven's decrees, that, at this time there will be few complaints and therefore few petitions will be received by the court. So we won't have a lot of work probably here. Now, again, I imagine this is wishful thinking. Du Fu was not too enthusiastic, perhaps, about his position in the administration, and both he and Shen Shen would be very soon after this date sent to minor provincial appointments, and so expelled from the gilded world of the court that is represented in this poem. So altogether, an interesting poem, especially if you're interested in knowing how the court and how the civil servants lived and worked. On the other hand, from a purely aesthetic or subjective point of view, it's a demonstration of friendship and of the antinomies that all scholar officials had to encounter. The double tension between serving and suffering, the adversities and the dangers, and the boredom of being in office, and the alternative, being free, enjoying life, enjoying the retired life, but also, making no important contribution to the world. And that's about it.